Sarah Chun walked into the community center on a cold Tuesday evening. She carried a simple black bag and wore a plain gray sweater. The building smelled like coffee and old books. People talked quietly in the hallway. Sarah found room 203 and stepped inside. The music classroom was small but warm. 20 folding chairs sat in rows facing an old piano. Sarah chose a seat in the back corner, away from the others. She liked quiet spaces. She had always been this way, even as a child. Other students filled the room slowly. There was Mrs. Peterson, who taught third grade and wanted to learn about classical music. Next to her sat Tom, a retired mechanic who loved opera. A young mother named Lisa brought her teenage daughter. They all seemed excited to be there. Sarah opened her notebook and wrote the date at the top of a clean page. She had beautiful handwriting, neat and careful. She had practiced writing music notes for many years, though no one here knew that. Professor Williams entered the room at exactly 7 o'clock. He was a tall man with gray hair and kind eyes. He taught music at the local college, but offered this evening class for people who just wanted to learn. He believed everyone should understand the beauty of classical music. "Good evening, everyone," Professor Williams said with a smile. "Welcome to Music Appreciation 101. Over the next 12 weeks, we will explore the greatest composers who ever lived. We will listen to their music and learn what makes it special." Sarah wrote every word in her notebook. She drew small musical notes in the margins. Her hand moved smoothly across the page like she had done this many times before. Professor Williams started with Bach. He played a recording of a beautiful piece called Air on the G string. The music filled the small room. Sarah closed her eyes and let the notes wash over her. She knew this piece well. She had played it many times, but she kept this to herself. "What do you hear in this music?" Professor Williams asked the class. Mrs. Peterson raised her hand. "It sounds peaceful," she said. "Very good," the professor replied. "What else?" Tom spoke up. "The melody goes up and down like waves." Sarah wanted to say more. She could explain how Bach used counterpoint to weave different melodies together. She could talk about the mathematical beauty of the composition, but she stayed quiet. She just wrote notes in her book. After class, some students gathered around Professor Williams to ask questions. Sarah packed her things slowly. She watched the old piano in the corner of the room. Its wood was scratched and some keys looked worn, but it was still a piano. Her fingers almost moved on their own, remembering. "Excuse me," Professor Williams called to Sarah as she reached the door. "I noticed you were taking very detailed notes." Sarah turned around. Her cheeks felt warm. "I just want to learn," she said quietly. "Have you studied music before?" he asked. "A little," Sarah replied. This was not exactly true, but it was not exactly false either. "I work at the library downtown." "I read about music sometimes," Professor Williams smiled. "Well, you ask very thoughtful questions. I hope you will share your ideas with the class next week." Sarah nodded and left quickly. She walked to her small car in the parking lot. The evening air was cold against her face. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment. Before starting the engine, 5 years ago, Sarah's life had been very different. She lived in New York City then. She wore beautiful dresses and played piano on big stages. People knew her name. Critics wrote good things about her concerts. She traveled to different countries and stayed in nice hotels, but that life ended when her mother got sick. Sarah moved back to her small hometown to take care of her. Her mother needed help every day. There was no time for concerts or travel. There was only time for love and care and saying goodbye. Her mother died 2 years ago. Sarah stayed in the small town. She found work at the library. She rented a tiny apartment above a bakery. She lived a quiet life now. Some days she almost forgot about her old life. Almost. Sarah drove home through empty streets. Her apartment was on the second floor. She climbed the narrow stairs and unlocked her door. The smell of bread from the bakery below always made her feel hungry. Her apartment was small but clean. She had a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and many books. In the corner sat an old keyboard. It had been her mother's. Sarah had not touched it since the funeral. She made tea and sat at her table. She opened her notebook and read what she had written about Bach. Her handwriting was still beautiful. Her thoughts about music were still clear, but something felt missing. At the library where she worked, Sarah helped people find books. She organized shelves and ran the children's reading program. Mrs. Martinez, who managed the library, always said Sarah was the best worker they ever had. She was quiet and careful and knew where everything belonged. Sometimes people asked Sarah for help finding books about music. She always knew exactly where to look. She could recommend the best books about different composers. But when people asked if she played an instrument, she always said no. This was easier than explaining. How could she tell them that she used to play for thousands of people? How could she explain that she once recorded albums and won awards? It seemed like a story about someone else now. Sarah finished her tea and got ready for bed. Tomorrow she would work at the library. She would help people find books and answer their questions. In the evening, she would come back to the community center. She would sit in the back corner and take careful notes. She looked at the old keyboard in the corner. Dust covered the keys. She had not cleaned it in months. Her fingers remembered how the keys should feel. They remembered songs she used to play, but remembering hurt sometimes. Professor Williams seemed like a good teacher. He really loved music. Sarah could tell by the way his eyes lit up when he talked about Bach. He wanted his students to feel that same love. This made Sarah happy. Thought about the other students in the class. They were all there because they wanted to learn something new. Mrs. Peterson probably went home and listened to classical music while she graded papers. Tom might surprise his wife by taking her to a concert. Lisa's daughter might decide to take piano lessons. Everyone was beginning a journey with music. Sarah was on a different kind of journey. She was finding her way back to something she had lost. Or maybe she was discovering that she had never really lost it at all. Sarah turned off the lights and went to bed. Outside her window, the small town was quiet. The bakery below was closed until morning. Soon she would wake up and start another day. But tonight she fell asleep with Bach's music still playing in her mind. 6 weeks had passed since the music class began. Sarah came to every meeting. She sat in the same back corner seat each time. Her notebook was now half full of careful notes about Mozart, Beethoven, and Chopin. Professor Williams had started to notice Sarah more. She always listened carefully. When he asked questions, she sometimes raised her hand. Her answers were always thoughtful, but she spoke so quietly that other students had to lean forward to hear her. Sarah has a real understanding of music theory. Professor Williams told his wife one evening. I think she could learn to appreciate much more complex pieces. The professor did not know that Sarah already understood more than he realized. She had studied music theory for many years. She had learned from some of the best teachers in the world. But she let him think she was just beginning to learn. On this Tuesday evening, Professor Williams had exciting news for the class. We have reached the middle of our course, he announced. It is time for something special. Each of you will choose a piece of classical music to study closely. You will research the composer and the history of the piece. Then you will present what you learned to the class. Mrs. Peterson looked worried. Do we have to play the music ourselves? Professor Williams smiled. That would be wonderful, but I know not everyone plays an instrument. You can just play a recording and explain what makes the piece special. Tom raised his hand. What if some of us want to try playing something? Even better, the professor said. The community center lets us use this piano. If anyone wants to attempt playing a simple piece, I encourage it. Music is meant to be played, not just heard. Sarah felt her heart beat faster. The old piano sat in the corner like it always did. She had been looking at it for 6 weeks. Sometimes she imagined sitting at the bench and touching the keys, but she always pushed these thoughts away after class. Several students gathered around Professor Williams to discuss their projects. Mrs. Peterson wanted to study a Mozart symphony. Tom chose a piece by Puccini because he loved opera. Lisa's daughter Emily picked a short piece by Debussy that she thought she might be able to play on their home piano. Sarah packed her notebook slowly. She was always the last to leave. Professor Williams was putting away his teaching materials when he noticed her still there. "Sarah," he said, "have you thought about what piece you would like to study?" She looked up from her bag. "I was thinking about Chopin," she said quietly. Professor Williams's eyes lit up. "Excellent choice. Chopin wrote beautiful music." "Which piece were you considering?" Sarah hesitated. She had been thinking about the Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It was one of her favorite pieces to play. But she could not say this. "I am not sure yet," she replied. The professor sat down in the chair next to hers. "You know, Sarah, I have been watching you these past weeks. You have a real gift for understanding music." Your questions showed deep thinking. Sarah felt her cheeks grow warm. "Thank you, but I am just learning like everyone else." "I think you could handle something more challenging than the others," Professor Williams continued. "Have you ever heard Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Of course she knew it. She had performed it dozens of times. It was the piece she played for her debut at Carnegie Hall. It was the piece that made critics call her a rising star and a young virtuoso. But she could not tell him any of this. "I think I have heard it," she said carefully. Professor Williams got excited. "It is one of the most beautiful pieces ever written. It tells a complete story without words. It has gentle moments and powerful moments. It shows everything that makes Chopin great." He walked over to the piano and sat on the bench. His fingers found the keys and he played the opening melody. The notes were simple but beautiful. Sarah knew exactly what came next. Her fingers moved slightly in her lap, following along. "Listen to how it starts so peacefully," the professor said as he played, "but then it builds to something much more dramatic. The technical demands are quite high, but the emotional content is what really matters." He stopped playing and turned to look at Sarah. "I think this would be perfect for your project. You could study the structure and maybe even attempt to play some of the easier sections." Sarah felt trapped. She wanted to say no. She wanted to choose something simple and safe. But Professor Williams looked so hopeful. He really believed he was giving her a wonderful opportunity. "It sounds very difficult," Sarah said. "It is challenging," the professor agreed. "But I have faith in you. Even if you can only manage a few measures, it would deepen your understanding of what makes Chopin special, and who knows, you might surprise yourself." Other students had started gathering around to listen. Emily looked at Sarah with wide eyes. "That piece sounds really hard," she whispered. Mrs. Peterson nodded. "Sarah, are you sure you want to try something so advanced?" Tom patted Sarah on the shoulder. "If Professor Williams thinks you can do it, I bet you can. You always seem to understand the music better than the rest of us." Double quote. Sarah felt all their eyes on her. They meant well. They wanted to encourage her, but they had no idea what they were asking. Playing the Ballade No. 1 was not just playing a difficult piece. It was opening a door to her past that she had worked hard to keep closed. "I could start working on it and see how it goes," Sarah heard herself saying. "If it is too hard, maybe I could switch to something easier." "Professor." Williams clapped his hands together. "Wonderful. I will email you some recordings and sheet music. There are also some excellent books about this particular ballade. The library probably has them." Sarah nodded. Of course the library had them. She had ordered most of them herself when she started working there. She had read them all on her lunch breaks, remembering what different scholars said about the piece she knew so well. "When are the presentations?" asked Emily. "In 4 weeks," Professor Williams replied. "That gives everyone time to really study their chosen pieces. Sarah, you might want to start practicing right away. This piano is available whenever the center is open." As the group broke up, Sarah gathered her things with shaking hands. 4 weeks. She had 4 weeks to pretend she was learning a piece she had mastered years ago. 4 weeks to act like a beginner struggling with one of classical pianos. Greatest challenges, she walked to her car in the dark parking lot. The autumn air was cold and sharp. She sat behind the wheel and tried to calm her breathing. Why had she agreed to this? She could have chosen a simple Mozart sonata. She could have picked a short piece by batch. Instead, she had let herself be talked into playing the piece that defined her former life. At home, Sarah made tea and sat at her kitchen table. She opened her laptop and found Professor Williams's email already waiting. He had sent links to 3 different recordings of the ballade. He had also attached the sheet music, though he noted that she should start with just the first page. Sarah clicked on the first recording. Immediately, her small apartment filled with the familiar opening notes. She closed her eyes and her fingers began to move on the table. She knew every note, every phrase, every dynamic marking. Her muscle memory was perfect, but her heart was breaking. This piece held so many memories. She remembered practicing it as a student, struggling to make her small hands reach all the notes. She remembered the first time she played it without mistakes. She remembered her teacher's proud smile. She remembered the standing ovation at Carnegie Hall. She also remembered the last time she played it. It was at a concert in Boston, just 3 days before she got the phone call about her mother. She had poured everything into that performance, not knowing it would be her last for a very long time. The recording ended. Sarah's apartment was quiet again. She looked at the old keyboard in the corner. Dust still covered the keys. But tomorrow she would have to start practicing. She would have to pretend she was learning something new. She printed the sheet music, though she did not need it. She made notes about when she could use the community center piano. She planned her lies about being a struggling beginner. As she got ready for bed, Sarah realized something. Part of her was excited. After 5 years of silence, she was going to play again. Even if she had to pretend it was difficult, even if she had to hide her skill, she was going to touch piano keys and make music. Maybe Professor Williams had given her a gift without knowing it. Maybe this was exactly what she needed. A way back to the music that had always been her first love. Sarah stood outside the community center at 9 o'clock on Wednesday night. The building was dark except for a few security lights. She held a key in her hand, the same key she used when she volunteered to clean the classrooms on weekends. Tonight, she would use it for something different. She had offered to help clean the center 6 months ago. Mrs. Rodriguez, who managed the building, was happy to have the help. "You are so reliable, Sarah," she had said when giving her the key. "I trust you completely." Now Sarah used that trust to slip inside the quiet building. The hallway was dark and her footsteps echoed. She found room 203 and turned on just one small lamp. The old piano waited in the corner, exactly where it always sat. Sarah approached the piano slowly. She had not touched piano keys in 5 years. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid that covered the keyboard. The keys were yellow with age and some had small chips, but they were still piano keys. She sat on the bench and placed her hands in position. Her fingers remembered exactly where to go. She pressed down on middle C very softly. The note rang out in the quiet room. It was slightly out of tune, but it was music. Sarah opened the sheet music she had brought, though she did not really need it. She knew the ballade no one by heart. Every note was stored in her memory like an old friend. But, having the music in front of her felt normal, like she was really learning. She began with the opening melody. Her right hand found the notes easily. The simple tune flowed from her fingers like water. It sounded different on this old piano than it had on the concert grand piano she used to play. The tone was warmer, more personal. For the first hour, Sarah played only the opening section. She forced herself to go slowly, to play with the care of someone learning. But her fingers wanted to run ahead. They remembered the excitement of the faster sections. They remembered the power of the dramatic climax. "One step at a time," she whispered to herself. She had to be patient. She had to act like a beginner. The next night Sarah returned, and the night after that. Every evening after work she drove to the community center. She always arrived after dark and left before anyone else might come. She became a ghost pianist, playing for an audience of empty chairs. By the end of the first week, Sarah had worked through the first 2 pages of music. She played them over and over, pretending to struggle with passages that her fingers knew perfectly. Sometimes she made mistakes on purpose, just to keep up the act, but alone in the dark room, she also let herself remember. She remembered what It felt like to play this piece with full emotion. She remembered the way audiences would hold their breath during the quiet sections. She remembered the thunderous applause after the final notes. During the day at the library, Sarah tried to focus on her work, but music played constantly in her head. Mrs. Martinez noticed that Sarah seemed different. "You have been humming a lot lately," Mrs. Martinez said one afternoon. "Are you happy about something?" Sarah blushed. She had not realized she was humming. "I am taking a music class," she explained. "I guess it is making me think about music more." "That is wonderful," Mrs. Martinez smiled. "I always thought you seemed like a musical person. There is something about the way you move, very graceful." If only she knew, Sarah thought. Mrs. Martinez had no idea that her quiet librarian had once danced across stages in beautiful gowns, bowing to standing ovations. In her second week of secret practice, Sarah allowed herself to play more of the piece. Her fingers flew through technical passages that would challenge most professional pianists. The muscle memory was perfect. It was like riding a bicycle after years away, but playing alone in the dark room also brought back painful memories. Sarah remembered the last concert she had played before leaving New York. She remembered packing her concert dresses and storing her awards in boxes. She remembered the silence of her apartment when there was no more music. Most of all, she remembered her mother. Her mother had been so proud of Sarah's career. She kept newspaper clippings of every review. She called all her friends when Sarah appeared on television. When Sarah came home to care for her, her mother had cried. "I am taking you away from your music," her mother had said. "Music will wait," Sarah had replied. "You are more important now." Sitting at the old piano, Sarah wondered if that was true. Had music waited for her? Or had she lost something that could never be found again? On Friday night of the second week, something changed. Sarah was playing through the middle section of the ballade when she forgot to hold back. The music took control of her fingers. She played with all the skill and passion she had once been famous for. The old piano seemed to come alive under her hands. Despite its age and flaws, it responded to her touch like a fine instrument. The room filled with rich, complex music that told the story Chopin had written so long ago. For 20 minutes, Sarah was not a librarian pretending to learn. She was a pianist, pure and simple. She was the artist she had always been, just in a different place, playing a different piano. When she finished, Sarah sat in the silence with tears on her cheeks. She had forgotten how good it felt to play with everything she had. She had forgotten the joy of making beautiful music, but she also felt guilty. She was lying to Professor Williams and her classmates. They thought they were helping a beginner learn a difficult piece. They had no idea they were watching a professional pianist pretend to struggle. During the third week of practice, Sarah started preparing for her performance. She decided how much skill she could show without raising suspicion. She planned which sections to play well and which sections to make look difficult. The hardest part was controlling her natural instincts. When she played the dramatic climax of the piece, every part of her wanted to use the full power and expression she was capable of, but she had to hold back. She had to play like someone who was trying their best but reaching their limits. Sarah also had to practice looking nervous. She stood in front of the mirror in her apartment and worked on appearing uncertain. She practiced walking to the piano like someone who was not sure they could succeed. It felt strange to practice failing when she knew she could play the piece perfectly. But this was her choice. She had chosen to live a quiet life. She had chosen to keep her past hidden. On Tuesday night, exactly 3 weeks after Professor Williams had suggested the piece, Sarah played it through completely for the first time. She held back her full skill, but she still played beautifully. The old piano sang with Chopin's melody and drama. When she finished, Sarah looked around the empty room. Tomorrow was the last class before presentations began. Next Tuesday, she would have to perform this piece in front of her classmates. She would have to act like it was the hardest thing she had ever attempted. As Sarah packed up her music and prepared to leave, she made a decision. She would play the piece as well as she could while still seeming like a beginner. She would honor Chopin's music and her own ability? Even if no one knew the truth, she turned off the lamp and locked the community center door behind her. 3 weeks of secret practice were over. Now came the hard part, performing while pretending to be someone she was not. But as Sarah drove home through the quiet streets, she realized something had changed. For 3 weeks, she had been a pianist again, hidden and secret, but still a pianist. The music had not forgotten her after all. It had been waiting, just like she had promised her mother it would. Tomorrow night, her classmates would see Sarah Chun, the quiet librarian who was bravely attempting a difficult piece. They would never know they were really watching Sarah Chun, the concert pianist who had once played this same piece for thousands of people. Both versions were true. Both versions were her. And for the first time in 5 years, that felt like enough. Tuesday evening arrived gray and cold. Sarah sat in her car outside the community center, watching other students arrive. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. In her bag was the sheet music for Chopin's Ballade No. 1, though she would not need to look at it. She had barely slept the night before. All morning at the library, she had made small mistakes. She put books in the wrong places and forgot to answer the phone twice. Mrs. Martinez had asked if she was feeling well. Just nervous about my music class presentation tonight, Sarah had explained. This was true, though not in the way Mrs. Martinez thought. Now Sarah sat in the parking lot, trying to calm her racing heart. She was nervous, but not about playing the piece. She was nervous about lying to people who had been kind to her. She was nervous about pretending to be less than she was. She took a deep breath and walked into the building. Room 203 was busier than usual. Family members and friends had come to hear the presentations. The folding chairs were arranged in rows like a small concert hall. Sarah found her usual seat in the back corner. She nodded to Mrs. Peterson, who looked nervous about her Mozart presentation. Tom was adjusting his tie and clearing his throat, preparing to talk about Puccini. Emily, Lisa's teenage daughter, sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the piano. Professor Williams stood at the front of the room with a big smile. Welcome, everyone, to our student presentations. Over the past 4 weeks, each student has chosen a piece of classical music to study deeply. Tonight, they will share what they have learned. Sarah watched the professor's excited face. He had no idea what was about to happen. He thought he was about to hear a brave beginner attempt a piece that was probably too difficult for her. He had no idea he was about to hear one of the finest interpretations of the ballade he had ever witnessed. Mrs. Peterson went first. She had chosen Mozart's Symphony No. 40. She spoke nervously about the composer's life and played a recording of the famous opening. Her presentation was simple but sweet. She clearly loved the music, even if she did not understand all the technical details. Tom followed with his presentation about Puccini's Nessun Dorma from the opera Turandot. He played a recording and explained why the aria moved him so much. His eyes filled with tears as he talked about the power of the human voice to express deep emotion. 3 more students gave presentations about various pieces. Each one was different, but all showed genuine love for the music they had chosen. Sarah listened and took notes, but her mind was also preparing for her own performance. Finally, Emily walked to the front of the room. She had chosen a short piece by Debussy called Clair de Lune. She sat at the old piano and placed her hands on the keys. Her fingers moved carefully through the gentle melody. She made a few small mistakes, but the beauty of the piece still came through. When Emily finished, everyone applauded warmly. She had worked hard and it showed. She had taken a risk by actually playing instead of just talking, and it had paid off. Her mother Lisa wiped away proud tears. Beautiful, Emily, Professor Williams said. That took real courage. Sarah's chest tightened. Soon it would be her turn to take courage, but in a completely different way. Finally, Professor Williams announced, we have Sarah Chun. Sarah has taken on quite a challenge. She has been working on Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, one of the most difficult pieces in the piano repertoire. Murmurs went through the small audience. Some people looked impressed. Others looked worried for Sarah. Mrs. Peterson leaned over to whisper, Something encouraging. Sarah stood slowly and walked to the front of the room. Her legs felt weak, but she tried to look determined rather than terrified. She placed her sheet music on the piano, though she would not need it. I chose this piece because Professor Williams thought it would help me understand Chopin better, Sarah began. Her voice was quiet and people leaned forward to hear. It has been very challenging for me. I'm not sure I can play it perfectly, but I wanted to try. This was all true, in a way. It had been challenging to pretend she did not know it. She was not sure she could play it perfectly while holding back her full ability, and she did want to try to find a balance. Between honesty and deception, Sarah sat on the piano bench and adjusted it slightly, buying herself a few more seconds. She looked out at the audience. Professor Williams smiled encouragingly. Her classmates watched with supportive expressions. No one suspected what was about to happen. Sarah placed her hands on the keys. For a moment she pretended to take a deep breath to calm her nerves. Then she began to play. The opening notes of the ballade flowed from her fingers like a gentle stream. The melody was simple but beautiful, and Sarah played it with just enough hesitation to seem like someone who had practiced hard but was still learning. The audience relaxed slightly. So far, Sarah was managing the piece reasonably well for a beginner. Professor Williams nodded approvingly. This was going better than he had dared to hope, but as the piece continued, something began to change. The music demanded more from Sarah, and her natural instincts started to take over. Her fingers moved with increasing confidence. Her touch became more sensitive, bringing out colors in the old piano that no one knew it could make. By the time Sarah reached the first dramatic section, she was playing with unmistakable skill. Her hands flew across the keys with perfect accuracy. The music swelled and danced, and sang with professional quality that filled the small room with power. Professor Williams's mouth fell open. This was not the playing of a struggling beginner. This was artistry of the highest level. His eyes widened as he listened to technical passages that would challenge conservatory. Students executed with flawless precision. The audience sat in stunned silence. Mrs. Peterson grabbed Tom's arm without realizing it. Emily stared with her mouth open. Even people who knew nothing about piano could tell they were hearing something extraordinary. Sarah was lost in the music now. She had forgotten about pretending to be a beginner. She had forgotten about hiding her skill. The ballade demanded everything she had, and she gave it gladly. Her fingers sang Chopin's story of love and loss and triumph with every ounce of passion she possessed. The piano seemed transformed under her hands. Despite its age and imperfections, it responded like a fine concert instrument. The room filled with rich, complex harmonies that told a complete emotional journey Chopin had imagined. As Sarah approached the climactic section, she played with the full power and expressiveness that had once made audiences leap to their feet. Her whole body moved with the music. Her face showed the deep emotion of someone who understood every note from the inside. The dramatic peak of the piece thundered through the room. Sarah's hands commanded the keyboard with authority that came from years of training and natural talent. This was not someone learning a difficult piece. This was a master pianist at the height of her powers. Then, as the music began to wind down toward its gentle conclusion, Sarah seemed to remember where she was. She pulled back slightly, trying to regain the appearance of someone who was doing her best with limited skill, but it was too late. Everyone had heard enough to know the truth. The final notes faded into silence. Sarah's hands remained on the keys for a moment, as if she could not quite believe what had just happened. She had meant to hold back. She had planned to seem like a talented beginner. Instead, she had played like the concert pianist she truly was. The silence stretched for what felt like forever. Sarah looked out at the audience and saw amazement, confusion, and dawning understanding on their faces. Professor Williams stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Finally, Tom started to clap. Slowly, others joined in. The applause grew louder and more enthusiastic until everyone was on their feet, giving Sarah the standing ovation she deserved but had not expected. Sarah sat frozen on the piano bench. Her secret was out. There was no way to explain what they had just heard as the work of a beginner. She had revealed herself completely, and now she would have to face the consequences. As the applause continued, Sarah realized something surprising. She felt relief. For 5 years, she had hidden who she really was. Tonight, without meaning to, she had shown her true self. It was terrifying, but it was also liberating. The applause finally died down, and everyone looked at Sarah expectantly. They wanted an explanation. They deserved one. Sarah stood slowly and faced the people who had welcomed her as a quiet librarian learning about music. It was time to tell them who she really was. Sarah stood beside the old piano, her hands trembling. The applause had stopped, but the silence that followed felt even louder. 20 pairs of eyes stared at her, waiting for an explanation. She could see the questions in their faces, the confusion, and wonder. Professor Williams was the first to speak. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Sarah, that was... I have never heard anyone play like that. Who are you?" Sarah looked down at her hands. These same hands had just betrayed her secret. For weeks, she had been so careful to hide her true abilities. But when the music called to her, she could not resist. She had played with her whole heart, and now everyone knew. "I owe you all an explanation," Sarah said quietly. Her voice was steady, but inside she felt like a small child who had been caught in a lie. "What you just heard. I have not been entirely honest with you." Mrs. Peterson leaned forward in her chair. "What do you mean, dear?" Sarah took a deep breath. "My name is Sarah Chun, and I work at the library." "That part is true, but I did not come to this class to learn about music. I came because I missed it. I came because I needed to find my way back to something I had lost." She paused, gathering her courage. The room was completely silent. Even the teenagers in the back had stopped whispering. "I used to be a professional pianist," Sarah continued. "I trained at the Juilliard School in New York. I performed with orchestras around the world. I recorded albums and won competitions. Music was my whole life." Professor Williams sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "But how is that possible? Why are you here in our little community class?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she continued. 5 years ago, my mother became very sick. She needed someone to take care of her every day. I was living in New York then, traveling for concerts, recording in studios. But when I got the phone call about her condition, I knew what I had to do." She walked closer to the audience, wanting them to understand. "I came home to this small town where I grew up. I moved in with my mother and became her caregiver. There was no time for practicing or performing. There was only time for doctor visits and medications and trying to make her comfortable." Tom wiped his eyes with his handkerchief. "That must have been very hard," he said gently. "It was the hardest thing I ever did," Sarah replied. "Not because taking care of her was difficult, but because I was losing two things at once. I was watching my mother get sicker every day, and I was also watching my career disappear, but I never regretted my choice. She was more important than any concert." Emily raised her hand shyly. "What happened to your mother?" "She died 2 years ago," Sarah said softly. "The cancer finally won. But I gotta be with her every day until the end. I gotta hold her hand and play her favorite songs on her old keyboard. She told me she was proud of me for coming home." The room was completely quiet except for a few sniffles. Lisa put her arm around Emily's shoulders. Sarah continued her story. "After my mother died, I thought about going back to my old life. My agent called several times. There were orchestras that wanted me to perform with them again. But something had changed inside me. I was not ready." She looked at Professor Williams. "So I stayed here. I got a job at the library. I rented a small apartment. I tried to build a quiet, simple life. I thought maybe I did not need music anymore. But you do need it," Mrs. Peterson said with understanding in her voice. Sarah nodded. "I was wrong. I tried to convince myself that I could be happy without music, but I was only fooling myself. When I saw the advertisement for this class, something inside me woke up. I thought maybe I could be around music again, even if I was not performing." Professor Williams stood up slowly. "So when I suggested the ballad ... I panicked, Sarah admitted. It was one of my signature pieces. I performed it at Carnegie Hall for my debut recital. I knew it better than almost any other piece in the world. But I could not tell you that. Why not? Asked Tom Dodd. Sarah thought for a moment before answering. I was afraid. I was afraid that if I admitted who I used to be, you would all treat me differently. I like being just Sarah, the quiet librarian who loved music. I was not ready to be Sarah Chun, the pianist, again. She walked back to the piano and placed her hand on the keys. But these past weeks, practicing this piece in secret, I remembered something important. Music is not just what I used to do. It is who I am. I can work at the library and live quietly, but I will always be a musician inside. Professor Williams approached her slowly, as if he was still not sure she was real. Sarah, do you have any idea how good you are? What you just played. I have heard that piece performed by world-famous pianists, and your interpretation was as good as any of them. Sarah blushed. I am out of practice. My technique is not what it used to be. Are you kidding? Emily burst out. That was the most amazing thing I have ever heard. You made that old piano sound like $1 million instrument. The other students began talking at once, all expressing their amazement and asking questions. Sarah felt overwhelmed, but also relieved. They were not angry with her for lying. They were not treating her like a celebrity. They were treating her like a friend who had shared something precious with them. Mrs. Peterson stood up and walked over to Sarah. My dear, thank you for trusting us with your story. I cannot imagine how difficult it must have been to give up your career for your mother. Thank you, Sarah replied. But I want you to know I did not give it up forever. Tonight, playing for all of you, I realized something. I am ready to be a musician again. Maybe not the same way as before, but in my own way. Professor Williams looked thoughtful. What do you mean? Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile she had worn in weeks. I mean, maybe I could teach piano lessons to children. Maybe I could play at the community center's fundraising events. Maybe I could help you with this class if you would like. There are many ways to share music with people. That would be wonderful, the professor exclaimed. Sarah, you could teach all of us so much. Would you really be willing to help? I would love to, Sarah replied. These past weeks, sitting in your class, I remembered why I fell in love with music in the first place. It was not about fame or critics or concert halls. It was about the joy of creating something beautiful and sharing it with others. Tom raised his hand. Sarah, would you play something else for us? Now that we know who you really are? Sarah looked around the room at the expectant faces. These people had accepted her story without judgment. They had welcomed her back to music with open hearts. What would you like to hear? She asked. Something that makes you happy, suggested Lisa. Sarah thought for a moment, then sat back down at the piano. This is a piece by Bach that my mother loved. I used to play it for her when she could not sleep. She began to play Bach's Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring. The familiar melody filled the room with peace and beauty. This time, Sarah did not hold back at all. She played with all the skill and love she possessed. As the music flowed around them, everyone in the room felt something special happening. They were not just listening to a beautiful performance. They were witnessing someone come home to herself. When the piece ended, there was no applause. The silence was too perfect to break. Finally, Professor Williams spoke. Sarah, I think we are all honored to have heard your story tonight. You have given us a gift much greater than just beautiful music. You have shown us what it means to love something so much that you sacrifice for it, and then what it means to find your way back to that love. Sarah wiped away tears she had not realized were falling. Thank you all for letting me find my way back. I did not know how much I needed this until tonight. As people began to gather their things and prepare to leave, many stopped to speak with Sarah. They thanked her for sharing her story and her music. They asked if she would really consider teaching. They invited her to play at church services and community events. Professor Williams was the last to approach her. "Sarah, I hope you know that what happened tonight was special. You trusted us with something very personal, and you gave us a performance that we will never forget." "Thank you for pushing me to play the ballade," Sarah replied. "I think you knew somehow that I needed to be pushed." The professor smiled. "I had no idea about your background, but I could tell you had a deep connection to music. I'm just glad I could help you find your way back to it." As Sarah drove home that night, she felt different than she had in 5 years. She was still the quiet librarian who lived above the bakery, but she was also Sarah Chun, the pianist, again. Both parts of herself could exist together. When she reached her apartment, Sarah looked at the old keyboard in the corner. Tomorrow, she would clean the dust from the keys. Tomorrow, she would start planning piano lessons for children. Tomorrow, she would begin a new chapter of her musical life, but tonight she was simply grateful. Grateful for her mother's love, grateful for Professor Williams's kindness, grateful for classmates who had accepted her story without judgment. Most of all, she was grateful that music had waited for her, just as she had promised it would. Sarah fell asleep that night with melodies playing in her mind, no longer afraid of the music that lived inside her. She had found her way home.